Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. And as we begin our dialogues today, I want to just note a conversation that I had this past Friday with several people from Ukraine and also Lithuania and a gentleman from the Netherlands. I mentioned that in our summit on Ukraine 2 weeks ago, the first session with Vladimir Posner, a journalist from Russia who's also lived extensively in France and the United States, went viral. And within a few days, had been seen by upwards of 45,000 people. And as a result of that, I've been getting various communications and emails from all kinds of people with many different points of view. And so I spent a couple hours on Friday just listening to the viewpoint of a woman who was forced to evacuate from her home in Ukraine, who has a 17-year-old son that is going through the decision-making process of coming to terms with being enlisted for the war. Also, someone from Lithuania who was there in 1991 when the Soviet Union sought to stop Lithuania from gaining its independence, and there was violence and death on the streets of Vilnius. And just wanted to bring in, as we begin our session today, the multi-perspectival nature of our reality. You know, that when any of these events happen, particularly war, people suffer universally. And the interpretive framework that they use is to understand what's going on and to galvanize hope or action and determination comes from many different sources. You know, and during our summit in Ukraine, we really looked at some of the meta views, the historical flow of events, and tried to track how, starting in the 1980s and 1990s with Gorbachev and sort of a détente and Gorby mania and this notion that there could be a peace dividend at the end of the Cold War, how did we end up with war in Ukraine? And we haven't touched really on the perspective of those in Ukraine. So it was very salutary for me to listen to it, and we'll be bringing their voices in over the next couple of summits that we'll be convening on Ukraine, because it's very important that we extend our empathy not only to the Russians as they've dealt with the expansion of the United States and NATO to the east in a way that threatens them now on their very borders, but that we also take into consideration the yearning for sovereignty in Ukraine, a country that has been possessed by empires and other nations for virtually the entirety of its history until it became independent in 1991, one of the newest nations on earth. So that perspective is so important. And what has been developing in my heart over the weekend as I've been reflecting on this are two things I want to just very briefly indicate. One is that the suffering that we're causing each other, the destruction that we're causing not only each other, but on our planet, has such deep historical roots that to fathom the origins and the whys and the wherefores is almost an impossibility. And in the face of that intractable reality of the pain that we're causing each other, to blame or to cast aspersions and say, that's the reason this is happening, is to forget one of the most fundamental realities in our world, and that's the blind people and the elephant. And that capacity to hold the whole empathetically, without casting blame, but focusing on what we need to do now to renew and to bring in a flourishing world and an abundance, not only in terms of human relations, but in terms of humanity's relation to the larger ecosystem, I believe is a realization whose time has come. And that brings me to the second point, and the reason why Humanity Rising was convened in the first place. And that is, as we examine unfolding world events, we're always looking for the opportunities in the crisis. And that's why in relationship to Ukraine, for example, the opportunity is for an immediate ceasefire and diplomacy so that we stop the carnage and we bring about a new way of understanding the multiplicity of the perspectives, but at least we're settling them, not through war, but through diplomacy, as nations have done since time immemorial and can do again, particularly in light of the escalating possibility of a nuclear exchange between the superpowers. And as we're going to see today, as we turn our attention toward climate and the fact that so many species are endangered now, including our own, the focus needs to be not so much on the etymology of the conflict, but what under current circumstances we can do to enable humanity to rise and to seize the opportunity inherent in the crisis to empower ourselves at this very critical moment in human history, made doubly fragile because of Ukraine. Because while we're fighting between the United States and Russia and the United States and increasingly China, and knowing that China and the Russians are now forming an alliance and the global South is remaining neutral, but beginning to shift allegiances in fundamental ways, we're not dealing with climate change. So that the inner relationship in our world between an escalating war and the fact that we've got to come together to deal with the real elephant in the room, and that is the very ecology under our feet is spinning out of control. Those are the issues that we want to encourage all of us at this time in human development to grapple with as seriously as we can, always with a view of how we can get ourselves out of this thicket through the inspiration that people like you're going to hear today are providing us in the actions that they're taking and the way that they're embodying the solutions that we all need to implement globally. Before we dive into that very rich subject, let us just pause as we always do on Humanity Rising, just to take a few moments to breathe together. The greater the external chaos, the greater the imperative for internal coherence and calm. And so we breathe together. So in a moment, you'll hear the sound of a bell. When you hear that bell, just breathe in very slowly for about 5.5 seconds. You hear another bell and just breathe out 5.5 seconds. It gives you about 5.5 breaths a minute. You bring in 5.5 liters of air, and the coherence that it produces inside your being. And the feeling of coherence in the community is extraordinary. So we're going to take 10 breaths together, and then we'll begin our program. Thank you, everyone. Welcome to Humanity Rising. Let us breathe together. Thank you, everyone. It's now my great pleasure to bring back on Humanity Rising, a very good friend and colleague who's integral to the development of Humanity Rising into Humanity Rising Network. We'll be doing a whole program on that next Monday on the 20th of March. Tom Eddington, who is a very successful executive coach and has run successful businesses. He's also the founder of Endangered.global, that brings people together around the world to ameliorate the causes for why over 1 million species now, including the human species, are teetering on the brink of extinction. And today he's going to start a 2-day program on celebrating action, which is the hallmark of Humanity Rising in our world. So Tom, I want to thank you for everything that you've done and turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Jim. Great to be with you today and the audience watching from around the world. I especially appreciated your opening remarks today. Not only are you sharing about your passion about working through the challenges that the world is facing in Ukraine and Russia, but you always put things in a greater context. And your reference to the blind man and the elephant is perfect for today's conversation. What I appreciate about the guests joining us today, John Perkins and Peter Fikowski, is that both of them are simultaneously trying to understand the elephant and taking action and helping people through their writing, through the different organizations they've created to help us understand the elephant. And they're not anchored in their position. They're constantly learning and growing and trying to understand what is the elephant. Certainly, when we look at climate change and the impact it's having on the environment, we have to acknowledge that human consciousness is part of the Earth's consciousness. We're not separated from nature. We're not separate from Mother Earth. And when we look at the actions that have to be taken, it's not just to save the million species of the 8 million known species on the planet that are on the endangered species list, but it's also to acknowledge and recognize that humanity is one of those 8 million, and the actions that we've been taking over the last several hundred years are threatening our own existence. So I want to bring John and Peter into the conversation. Peter's an author, a business and climate leader, and has been for decades. He's committed to leaving the world a world we're proud of for our children. He's the founder of global initiatives for climate restoration, and there's a lot of conversation and discussion around climate change. But what we need to do is to acknowledge and recognize that we have to restore the climate. So while it's important that our organizations, companies around the planet, governments move to net zero to stop putting more CO2 and methane into the atmosphere, but also we have to sequester that excess CO2 and methane out of the atmosphere. Some of the organizations Peter has created are Foundations for Climate Restoration, Methane Action, which is a nonprofit organization that's in process, Healthy Climate Alliance, founder and president of the Automated Visual Inspection, and most recently the publisher or author and publisher of a book, Climate Restoration: The Only Future That Will Sustain the Human Race. Also joining us today is a frequent guest. We're grateful to have John Perkins with us again today. As a chief economist at a major consulting firm, John was advisor to the World Bank, the UN, IMF, and many Fortune 500 corporations and leaders of countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, and the US government agencies. His 10 books, including Confessions of an Economic Hitman and Shapeshifting, spent over 70 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, are published in more than 35 languages, and sold over 2 million copies. He's lectured at more than 50 universities, been featured on ABC, NBC, CNN, Time, the New York Times, Elle, Der Spiegel, and many others. John's recent book is a third edition of Confessions of an Economic Hitman, where he focuses on how China is the third iteration of economic hitmen on the planet. So welcome, Peter and John. Please turn on your videos and join us.
Great to be with you, Tom, and Jim, and everybody else out there, and you, Peter. It's an honor once again to be with you. I love what you guys are doing. It's such incredibly important work and so timely. Thank you.
Yeah, so, Tom, thank you for bringing us together and really taking on humanity rising. It's probably the thing everybody wants and no one wants to talk about. So thank you for wanting to talk about it and talking about it.
Yeah, I was over the weekend, I was watching a video where we've seen the devolution of American media that, if you're a guest on a program, a really significant period would be 4 minutes of airtime. And, part of the format of Humanity Rising is to go deep into a conversation. And, so we'll spend an hour or 90 minutes having the opportunity for the panelists to be in dialogue and in discussion around what's urgent, what matters, what's relevant to them, and not just a 30-second or a 60-second clip or a soundbite. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. And John, I'd like to start with you, particularly the work you've done throughout your career, not only as an economic hitman, but shining a spotlight on it and expanding that spotlight beyond economics with your shamanic work and training there to really look at this species we call humanity and how do we want to be on the planet. And so I would just invite you to share some thoughts, particularly from your most recent book, and how we seemingly are learning. In the case of the Chinese, they're learning from our mistakes and our habits rather than expanding their vision to really understanding how do we ensure that humanity thrives.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I think that last point is very important, that I was teaching in an MBA program in China, their top MBA program. And, it was really interesting how the students who were handpicked really to be China's future leaders, they wanted to pick my brain about what I had done that was successful as an economic hitman, which basically is to steal resources from lower income countries that have lots of oil, copper, now lithium and cobalt and the other metals that are necessary to the green economy. What had I done in my time that made me so successful at this? And what had I done that made mistakes? And I began to realize, they were just trying to emulate us. That was a few years ago. And now since then, they've not only emulated us, they've done a much more efficient job and had now basically control the resources of most of Africa and Latin America and much of the rest of the world. At the same time, I recognize that the Chinese students were very, very concerned about the terrible pollution they've grown up with. And they don't want that for their children and grandchildren. They've experienced it. Americans, we haven't really, a few people in Los Angeles for a short period of time, but most of the world has experienced tremendous crises already. We in the United States talk about, well, when things really get bad, well, things have gotten really bad for most of the world. And as Jim pointed out earlier, for so many species. So I think we're at this incredible time in human history. We're at an evolution. We are at a rising. We need to be at a rising. Humanity is understanding. And I don't want to dominate the conversation here, but we mentioned the indigenous people. One of the things they taught me is that perception molds reality. They totally believe this. And that's modern psychology. That's physics. It's marketing. It's politics. When we, if we can get people to change their perception, then we change reality. And we've had this perception, which the Chinese are now sharing, that the goal of business, the goal of life, the goal of human life basically is to maximize materialistic gain in the short term. That's the perception that's created an economic system that's failed us, a global social, political economic system, which we could define as a death economy. If we can change that perception, we turn everything around. And that's, it's really why I wrote this third book in the trilogy, the Economic Hitman trilogy, because the hope is there that we can use the very processes that economic hitmen in the United States and China have used to get us to this death economy. We can use those same processes, which basically involve a change of perception, to transform the death economy to a life economy.
Yeah, thank you, John. And I do want to dive in a bit because you and I were together when you came out with the second edition. And so I'd like to explore a little bit about how your consciousness has shifted and your intentions have shifted with the writing of the three books. And Peter, I'd like to bring you into the conversation and talk about a bit about your background as a businessman that has continued to be successful in the commercial sector, but your passion and your commitment to nonprofits and particularly your focus on climate change.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. John really inspired me over the decades. I've been friends with Bill and Lynn Twist and Pachamama for a long, long time, and John was on the peripheries. But it's a honor, John, to be on with you here. My background, of course, is in physics. I did astrophysics, worked at NASA. I worked in artificial intelligence for a while and started my software business here in Silicon Valley. But it was my work in advocacy for hunger and poverty issues that got this whole conversation going. And we made phenomenal progress, in the 80s and the 90s, and even in the early 2000s. And I often wondered, what is it we're trying to do? That is, the success of hunger and poverty work is usually measured in lives saved or GDP increased, depending on who your audience is. And neither of them seemed particularly profound. That is, okay, so someone's GDP goes up, So what? And then, I've, in terms of saving lives, I've always learned that everyone ends up dying in the end. So you really don't save a life, you just extend a life. And right, once you talk about extending a life, you now go right into what quality did I extend it into? And it's not a either or. It's not, do I extend it or not? It's like, wait, maybe we should be focusing on the quality of life. And, in standard economics, we think, well, if you have more money, then your quality of life is better. That may be true. The place I've ended up, and I developed the field of climate restoration because I could see that it didn't matter what one's philosophy is. If we go extinct, it's game over for humanity, which is not a problem for nature, right? If you've ever been in a unused lot, nature does fine when humans aren't there, but it's a problem for us, and for people who are concerned about consciousness, that might be an issue for consciousness. I don't know what consciousness is yet, so I stay away from that. I may have it, but I don't understand it. The problem with being a physicist is we sometimes are very naive. But the place where I've ended up is realizing that, and this really goes into your conversation about consciousness, is that the human species is now one species. And that in our evolution for millions of years, we started out as tribal. And it was natural for tribes to learn to defend themselves against opposing tribes. And what John said about what China is doing is brilliant in that framework, which we've evolved into. I would think that there's evolutionary forces there, but whether it's evolutionary or language doesn't matter. And we've reached a point in humanity where we're all in it together. And the Ukraine war, for me, really illustrates it, where most of the world is organizing, saying, okay, no more taking over territory like Russia is taking over Ukraine. That phase of humanity is over. We're one tribe now. And Tom, what I love about this series is we have to invent what it is to be one tribe, because on our planet, there's probably almost certainly never been a single species that was unity over the whole planet. And so we have to make up this game from scratch. I liken it to the game of Monopoly, right? Where you just look at the back of the box top, and you read the directions and you follow the directions. It's easy, it's fun. And you get angry and you go through all the thing, and you can spend hours enjoying it. If you take the look at the back of the box top that we've got now, it's blank, Tom and John. And what we're doing here is actually beginning to write, what are we going to put there? Because it's never been done before on our planet. And so anyway, so that's sort of my interest. My activity has been to make sure we make it, right? So I developed the field of restoring the climate, and we may or may not want to talk about that. But the bottom line is, we know that global warming is CO2, and we have to get CO2 back to pre-industrial if we want to guarantee the survival of our children. That's pretty simple. Saying it another way, just a number here, that the highest CO2 level humans have ever survived is 300. 280, a little below that is what was optimal, allowed us to develop agriculture. Anything above 300 is playing Russian roulette with our children. And that's simply immoral. End of story. So, and when I had that realization, it made solving the climate very easy, because now we have a what and a by when. We have to get CO2 below 300 because it's immoral to play Russian roulette with our kids. And we have to do it while we still can. And once you do that, once you define the problem, it turns out that nature has given us the solutions. They cost almost nothing. but we have to change the writing on the instructions. The UN said our goal is to stabilize CO2, but that's wrong. We have to restore and stabilize. That's simple, because we know how to do it. It's just that the instructions are wrong. And so that is one of our goals for this year. Similarly, population, that our planet had a stable population for 10,000 years. We broke the cycle by raising the child survival rate. We tripled it, and our population is up tenfold. Well, that's not survivable. And again, it's immoral to play Russian roulette. We want to go back to what it was 100 years ago. That's sort of the typical expectation of experts. And again, we can do it. By the end of the century, those of us on this call will all have died natural deaths. It's just a question of how many births. And families are very smart. If the culture says we're going to a sustainable population, families will naturally say, okay, good, then we should have 1 or 2 kids. And some will have 3 or 4, and some will have 0. But our species is very smart. We're very social. Anyway, the point is that now that the work that I and my teams have done is saying that we can actually physically restore the climate quite easily, and we're going to do it. There's no one opposing us, really, and we can talk about that. We can restore a sustainable population once we define it. That what made the moonshot go so well was President Kennedy gave us a what and by when, and everyone lined up said that's a fun game, even though it didn't fundamentally impact humanity, right? It just was continuation of the Cold War from one perspective, but it was a fun game, and so we can win those games now. That's what the thing that you're talking about, Tom, is we can leave a world for our children where nature, as I talk to people, what everyone wants, I assert, is a beautiful nature, lush nature, the nature that we belong to. Now, at the moment where the CO2 levels are what T-Rex liked, but so we want to bring it back to the nature that we're part of, and we want everyone to participate. It hurts everyone when people are dying, like in Ukraine. So it's like, enough of that. We don't need that anymore. We've matured past that. And I think it's fairly simple, but the key is really getting clear. That's where we're going: a sustainable population, sustainable climate, and everyone gets a chance to contribute, to be healthy and contribute. And
so, John, what's the game that we're playing from your perspective, and what's the what and the when?
Well, I like what Peter had to say, is because part of the life economy is creating businesses that mine all the plastic in the oceans and clean up pollution in many other ways, that restore coral reefs in the ocean and restore, rejuvenate destroyed environments, that recycle, that create new technologies. We've come a long way with solar and wind in a very few years, but there's things out there that we haven't even thought about yet, or haven't gone far enough to bring to the level where they're economically viable. We can do that. So this is not about stopping growth. People often say we've got to stop growth. I don't agree with that at all. We've got to stop the kind of growth that we've been experiencing, yes, but we need to grow in the ways that Peter was talking about, paying people to clean up pollution, to do these things that are going to take us to a new level. And it's been happening. When we've had Peter's doing it, he's got companies that do it. There's benefit corporations, B corporations. There's the idea of conscious capitalism. There's so many things that are leading us to a new perception of what it means to be successful. So rather than this idea of maximizing short-term materialistic gain, as we've defined materialistic gain in the past, profits for corporations and so forth, we need to really look at maximizing long-term benefits. But we can hire people to do that. We can pay people. We can create a whole economic system around that. I do think we have to be very careful with the population issue, because what we're really asking is for the global South to reduce its population growth, and because that's where it's all happening. And you know, I spent a lot of time in the global South, particularly Latin America, and know that people rely on their children to bring them through old age. So while I agree that we need to address this problem and cut back on population growth, it has to be done in a way where these people in these other countries no longer have to depend on their children, where they have some sort of a social network, like, you know, Social Security, and a system that takes care of them in their old age. That's the way to encourage them to stop having children. That's part of the process. Yeah. And unfortunately, you know, now in the United States, there's this talk about cutting back on Social Security here and Medicare, and everyone says, oh, no, we're not talking about that, but we all know that they are talking about that. And instead, we need to be moving much more forward with these ideas where people are not having to have more children and struggle so hard to make sure that they have something to take care of them in their old age. But I'm very excited. I think we should all feel blessed that we're alive at this time. It's a time of incredible transformation. And Tom, as you mentioned at the beginning, I spent a lot of time and written 5 books on indigenous cultures. Every one of them, all over the world, has a prophecy. And these prophecies go back thousands of years in many cases. The Mayan prophecy, the eagle and the condor prophecy, on and on and on. And all of these prophecies, and this includes the Christian prophecy and the Jewish prophecy and the Muslim prophecy and the Hindu prophecy and the Buddhist prophecy, they all tell us that we would reach a point in time with the opportunity to move into a new vision of what it means to be human, of humanity rising, a new consciousness. And all of them basically pinpoint this period in history as being that time. And, you know, every one of our listeners here is born into this time, because every one of you has a role to play. You were born, the indigenous people would say, you were born at the time you were born to the parents and into the situation that you were born into, because you have a learning curve to go on and a role to play in realizing the prophecies, because the prophecies always all say that we will reach this portal, this time, with an opportunity. But the prophecies say, all of the prophecies say it's up to us, human beings, to make it happen. It doesn't happen by itself. You know, the Mayan prophecy is a very interesting one, where they say that there's been this old ancient ruler named Seven Macaw, who's brutal and selfish and egotistical and materialistic. And he's ruled for a long time. And the hero twins, who I like to think of as a boy and girl, some interpret it as 2 boys, but, you know, with things, and sometimes it's not really even important if you look at mythology. But the hero twins cut off his head and put it in a basket and replaced him with Hunahpu, a generous, compassionate leader. And the prophecy says that that's a representative of the old times of Seven Macaw and the new times of Hunahpu, moving from what we could call the death economy to a life economy, of death systems to life systems. But the prophecies say that the leader's not going to cut off their own heads. You know, Putin's not going to cut off his own head. Neither's Biden, neither's Xi, none of them are. And they can't. That wouldn't work anyway. We have to do it. We the people, we the hero twins. That's the symbolism there. And that's so common of so many of the prophecies, a similar message, that we've entered this time of opportunity, and we the people have to take advantage. And of course, we're seeing it happen. You know, the incredible change of consciousness that's happened during my lifetime, and particularly in this millennium. You know, we all thought, you know, there's this belief that on, you know, what was it, Y2K, everything was going to change. The clocks were going to stop, the computers were going to shut down. There was going to be catastrophe. Well, there wasn't, but everything has changed since. And 9/11 played a big role in that, but all kinds of things. The pandemic, there's just so much has happened in these last 23 years that we have entered this period. The prophecies are being realized, and the opportunity is here for each one of you out there to play your role. And one of my motivations for writing this third book was because I lay out things that we can all do, and Peter's doing some of those on a very practical level. But it's also about how does each one of us reach into our souls and do what will bring us the greatest satisfaction for the rest of our lives, because that's the only way we're going to really do it and be successful. And at the same time, how do we apply that to transforming the death economy to a life economy? And there's a series of questions for each of us to answer. So I would say, for example, as a writer, I love to write. I'm going to keep writing. I write a lot of stuff that never gets published because I enjoy writing. It's like a meditation for me. It's kind of like a concert pianist plays the piano, not just when he or she is on the concert stage, but all the time. And I'm going to write about things that I hope will inspire people to transform the death economy to a life economy. I have a carpenter friend who's at the opposite end of the spectrum, you might say. He wants to, for the rest of his life, he wants to work with his hands and wood, but he's going to apply that by only using sustainable materials, and telling his clients that if they have to pay a little bit more for the sustainable materials, that's not a cost. It's an investment in the future for him and his family, or her and her family, and future generations. So we're at this incredible time, this inflection point, this portal. And, my hat's off to both of you for the work that you do, and Peter for getting involved on a very practical level with these corporations and with technologies that will help reverse the process of carbon dioxide, of global warming, basically, or global change, global catastrophe, reverse that process.
Peter, do you want to comment on John's?
Yeah. So John, I love that. As a scientist, one of the great things that's happened this century is our understanding of how the brain works. And we like to say the brain is a pattern machine, that you learn a pattern. If you learn piano or learn to hit a baseball, it's practice, 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 and the neurons learn patterns and integrate sensory and action. And in this transition time where we're going from a sort of a tribal, it used to be, as I said, it used to be one tribe versus another, or one country versus another. And it was fine that, if one country failed, another one took over. If one empire fell, when the Roman Empire fell, and other empires took over, and the planet worked fine. When we fall, it'll be the cockroaches, maybe not so good. But the point right there is we have to. It's not enough to just take action. We have to realize that we have brain patterns, both individual and collective, for this win-lose. You call it the death economy, but it's always been win-lose. Any culture which says, "Oh, we're just kumbaya, we're nice," they got clobbered by a neighbor at one point. But now we have to knowingly create new brain patterns for all of us working together, at the same time honoring our design for I'll say conflict, competition. I don't know the right word, but think of the World Cup. We love the World Cup. We love the World Series. We love these competitions. It's just part of our genetic makeup. Or another way of saying it is we love adventure. Seeing what do I know that he doesn't know, and find out. And then obviously at the end of the competition, we both know it now. So honoring both sides of that and creating something new. And I want to learn from you, John, do a lot more writing, because it's so important that we visualize that future of humanity working together. At the same time, we have diversity. A challenge that I offer to younger generations now is, we've again, it's not well known, but we've got the technology and the economics, and we know how to restore the climate. It's going to happen by 2050. Again, I can give technical presentations on that, and this is the wrong place for that. We getting the global population back to something that the planet will sustain again. We know exactly how to do that. But then the problem is we have all this communication, we have the transportation, we have intermarriage. None of us want our planet to become a gray homogeneous blob. We want the diversity, which we don't see here, right? There you have 3 old white men, but but we know there are a lot of women and non-white, everyone on listening to us, and thank God, and we want to keep it that way. And I don't know how the next generation is going to do it. Our generation developed computers and went to the moon and iPhones and all those things. The next generation, their challenge is to keep the planet interesting. We'll restore it. I guarantee you it. The 3 of us and lots of others are not going away until we've got the CO2 back to sustainable levels, and the vision of having small families till we get to a sustainable population. That's going to happen. Now, how are we going to keep the planet interesting? That's the challenge.
Yeah, I'll pick up on a couple of things that have been there for me. So, John, when you came out with your second Economic Hitman book, we were in conversation, and you talked about when the first book came out, it was wildly successful, but you heard from people saying, "I've read the book, I'm disheartened. What the hell can I do about it? That the systems are rigged against me." And so you created the second book, which was here's a plan of action that people can take. And with your third book, you're shining a light on the perpetuation of this old way of operating. Peter, picking up on a comment that you shared, I had a chance to work on the Third Harmony film with the Meta Center a couple of years ago, which is the true story of humanity. That we are hardwired for nonviolence, we're hardwired for cooperation. And accompanying the film was a board game. And the board game, unlike Monopoly, which you referenced, or any other game that we have, the only way you can win is if you collaborate and you cooperate, which is in our inherent nature. Yes, we have a piece of us that is competitive, that loves the exhilaration of a competition, but we're hardwired for collaboration and cooperation. So just picking on something both of you have talked about is, how do we create that story? How do we create that vision, that awareness that's inherent in all of us about a different way of being on the planet?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. I like to think of, if there were a fleet of UFOs hovering above us, or I'd like to think if there were, they would be peaceful, but let's assume that they're not. And we're feeling very, very threatened by these aliens. What do? Well, I think the United States and China and Russia and Brazil and India and everybody else, I think we come together. We join forces to protect our common interest. And in that process, we may compete on developing approaches and technologies that will help deter the threat. I think we can look at right now that the aliens are here. We're them. And it's not the human species, it's our attitude. It's our belief that we are apart from, not a part of nature. As someone mentioned earlier, I think it was you, Tom, that the indigenous philosophy and the idea of the 7th generation is that we are a part of nature, and all the indigenous people I've lived with and all of our ancestors, come from this aspect of we're a part of nature. We're not supreme over it. There's no human supremacy, but today we believe in human supremacy. And as a collective, not as, I'm not saying a lot of us speaking don't, and a lot of those people tuned in don't, but as a collective, the idea that we can we can do whatever we want to this planet. We can exploit her, we can ravage her in any way we want because we're supreme. We are a part from, not a part of nature. That's how we view it. So if we can get back to recognizing that we are the aliens, we have alienated ourselves from our planet, then we can say, okay, China, Russia, India, Brazil, everybody, we can all come together to figure out a way to quell this alienation that we have, to destroy, maybe that's too strong a word, I don't even like to use that kind of language, but to transform this alienating philosophy. And again, it's not humans, throughout most of human history, people have believed they were a part of nature, not apart from, for 200,000 years. So it's only been within the last blink of an eye that we've seen ourselves as apart from nature. I think there's a real motivating factor there. When I was teaching in this program in China at this MBA program, the students there said, we created an economic miracle here in China. 10% economic growth for 30 years. We brought 700 million people out of dire poverty. The rest of the world combined hasn't done that. But it's come at a horrible cost, socially and environmentally, that we've experienced, we young people. And so we've proven we can create a miracle. We're going to create a green miracle. This is what these young Chinese students were telling me. We want to use your system to create a green miracle. And will they do it? I don't know, but I know the young people talking to me were serious. I came back to the United States, and very shortly after I got back, I was speaking at Cornell University, which happened to be holding a meeting for about 2,000 MBA students from across the United States. And I told them what I'd heard from these Chinese students, and I said, don't you let it happen. Let's here in the United States, let us become greenest country. And I love what, Peter, you said about the World Cup. And I said this to them. I said, let's create a World Cup in green every year. Which country has done the most, to rejuvenate the planet in the past year? And let's honor that. And we can look at this alien picture. We can see this commonality that we all share. We all know Russians and Chinese and Venezuelans and all people who are just who all know that we need the same thing. One of the biggest problems is leadership. Throughout history, it's been these sociopathic, narcissistic leaders that have dragged the people down the wrong way, and they've used all kinds of excuses. We're spreading civilization, the Romans said, we're spreading civilization in Latin, the Roman language, or we're spreading Christianity, or we're spreading Catholicism, or we're spreading Islam, or we're spreading Judaism, or whatever it is. And we in the United States have said, well, we're spreading democracy and capitalism, even though often we've destroyed democratic leaders. But we have this story that we tell ourselves that says we're better than them. We're better than them. Well, let's admit that all of us are spreading an alienating view of what it means to be a successful species on this planet. We've alienated ourselves with our philosophy of business, of sociology, of politics. It's time to come together to recognize that we've got to defeat those aliens.
Yeah, well, that's great, John. The thing that's important, I think, to notice is that change is happening much more quickly now, of course, than any time in human history, or perhaps history of our planet. And so we have to be very flexible. And so, I never like to make other leaders wrong. That is, I look at Putin, and he's doing what he had to do. That is, if I grew up in the KGB, I would perfectly well do what Putin is doing, because that's the world he grew up in. That's the playbook that was ingrained in his mind and in his community. And making him wrong, of course, separates us. And so, we have to honor our past, even the past that we hate. We have to honor it, that was part of the playbook. Because once you realize, honor the playbook, you can rewrite the playbook. And so I have railed against the UN for setting us on this, but I'm taking it back. Before I finish the sentence, I'll say I'm taking it back. But in the past, I railed against the United Nations for setting us on a climate goal of stability 50% of CO2, 50% higher than humans ever have survived long term. Clearly suicidal. Now that's the bad evil me speaking. That's the playbook they had in 1990. CO2 levels were almost, were barely above what was survivable. It was reasonable for them to say, let's reduce the damage. But it's 30 years later and things are falling apart rapidly. But once we honor that, when they wrote those rules, that made sense. It doesn't make sense now in 2022. And the same of the rules of war. It made sense. Probably everyone listening hates the way war is fought, but the truth is, it worked. Lao Tzu has quotes that I use all the time, and so on. But we have to rewrite it. We have to honor that past and those leaders so that we can actually create something new. So I'm very excited about this time. And I think it's very important. I've discovered that it's very important to notice the beliefs that I have and how those beliefs are primarily a method of separating myself from people with different beliefs. Because I'm sure, Tom, you and I believe different things about something. Who cares? Right? It's just like, here's what's in this head, and there's what's in that head. Who cares? Now, in the evolutionary history, our DNA system figured out, if he believes something different, he may belong to a different tribe, which might try to kill my tribe. And so if I'm scared, I'll watch out for someone with different beliefs. And that made sense until now. Now we can tolerate anyone believing anything because it's just a thought pattern in a brain, which you couldn't even identify. At least, maybe in 30 years, they'll be able to figure out what the brain patterns mean. But right now, it's like understanding what's going on in my iPhone. I don't know. And so letting go of our importance of beliefs, that is just we're all in it together. And like we were saying with the World Cup, having different beliefs is fun, but just like Germany versus Sweden or something, it's a fun competition, but really is of no serious consequence. What's of serious consequence is that our grandchildren and 7 generations out have a nature which is lush and diverse cultures which are flourishing and getting even more diverse. And as I said earlier, I don't know how our children are going to do that. And I won't find out because I'm at the age that by the time they do, I probably won't be alive. But I trust them. I'll be alive in their existence.
I'm just following some of the comments in the chat, and there's a comment here from Dr. Cuff Ferguson, where he references his book Evolving the Human Race Game: A Spiritual and Soul-Centered Perspective. And in the book, he indicates that he called it aggressive collaboration, to embrace our tendencies to both be aggressive toward one another and to give form to our innate essence to collaborate. And that's I think it's an appropriate framing in part for what we've been talking about in terms of where is humanity and how do we evolve.
Yeah, one of the indigenous leaders who I've begun working with told us on a call yesterday, it's all about love. And which struck me, I hadn't heard it that way, but inside of love, there's belonging. And that's what we can do, is actually develop that love for others and notice when our emotions want to snap and kill them, and realize that that's just an emotional thing out of our past. It has to be there, and we can enjoy it. It does go away. The anger always goes away. And but love persists, right? Think about it. Love persists year after year, decade after decade, perhaps even generation after generation.
Well, I think also, Peter, it's important to recognize that all of our emotions are just energy. It's what we do with them. So I'm angry as hell. And I have been much of my life, starting with the Vietnam War, I suppose, at some of the things that happen in the world and what my own government does, as well as other governments, and what our corporations do. But I used to direct that energy toward, destructive means, and even self-destructive, that didn't work too well. And now I'm still angry, but I'm having a lot of fun with it. I write books, I get here, and so I think I can direct that energy toward love in a way. Nonetheless, the anger is there. And I think it's important to recognize that every listener out there, if you're angry, you're angry. Don't fight it. If you're sad, don't say, I can't be sad. I can't be angry. I'm above all that. No. Those are human qualities. It's what you do with them. So direct your sadness and your anger. I'm having the greatest time of my life. I'm really enjoying everything I do, and I'm still very angry. But I'm not throwing stones. I don't take it out on anybody else. I don't take it out on my cat or my soulmate partner, who's just a wonderful person. And I don't take it out on breaking windows. But so I think it's important that we realize that our emotions are very valid, but it's what we do with them. It's what we do with them. And I think, again, Peter, you're a great example. You've seen things. I don't know whether you're angry or sad or what, but something triggered you to say, I don't like things the way they are, and so I'm going to direct my energy to changing them. I'm going to form some corporations. I'm going to write a book. I'm going to do so and so and so and so to turn that around. And I think we can all use that as a model. That what is each one of you listeners out there? How do you direct what you're feeling about what's going on in the world right now in a way that'll bring you the greatest satisfaction, and work to changing that at the same time? And it can be, it can be as simple as sending a text out or an email every day, and encouraging your social networking circles to convince a corporation that you pick to say something like, hey, I love your products, but I'm not going to buy them anymore until you pay your workers a fair wage in Indonesia. Or you clean up the pollution you've caused, and you send it out to your social networking circles and ask them to send it to all of theirs. Things like that have a big impact, and they're really simple to do. It can be that simple, or it can be as complex as running for president of the United States or whatever country you happen to be in. So, but we all can look at what is going to bring me joy, what is going to turn this anger, this sadness, this sense perhaps of hopelessness. How can I use that in a constructive way to make things better and to make life more enjoyable for me personally?
Yeah. Well, but making life more enjoyable for me personally, it's all of us. Like, because me personally, like John, if you're not happy, and you're a very happy man, I can see, even with your anger. I love your anger, and I just got a real taste of it. It's like, oh, thank God John is angry. I wouldn't have read your books and met you other than that. But it's all of us together. So when things go well, my whole community is happy. And they may be angry and sad and suffering. I have no problem with suffering. When I've analyzed it as a scientist, suffering is just a belief that it should be some other way than it is. When I accept that it is the way it is, I'm happy. That's that simple.
Yeah. Well,
I'm just once again just following the comments, and there was a reference from somebody about we're in the sixth mass extinction, and where humanity is responsible for that in large part. And a program we had back in January, one of the guests was Dr. Zach Bush. And Zach was talking about how, yes, humanity has contributed to this sixth mass extinction in part by extracting all of this CO2 out of the ground and put it into the atmosphere. But whatever species replaces us on this planet will benefit from all that CO2 in the atmosphere. It was very, very provocative way of thinking about this extinction. But the point he was making is that each species that has replaced the existing species on the planet has been present at a higher evolved state of consciousness. And it was a very different way of holding this period of time that we're in now. I haven't heard anybody else share that perspective. I can't embrace it. But I do appreciate that, the consciousness of the planet is certainly part of what we are part of, but it has its own plan, its own ideas about humanity.
Yeah,
Well, I think
go ahead, Peter.
I think one of the key goals is diversity. That is, my experience and everyone I know, we love traveling to different places. Again, John, I love your books because you're traveling different places, and I'm sure you'll never stop. I expect you'll never stop, because we're designed for that, and we should be designed for exploration. And so the sixth extinction, whether we're cause or the victim of it, doesn't matter. We want to stop it. We want to get the diversity exploding again, like it has been, in the recent past in the Amazon and before we got here. So, and we can do it. That's the interesting thing. Again, in the science of neurology, the way our brains learn to relate to other people happens when we're born 1 and 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. And we relate to, most of our relations are sort of like a parent and a child, a father-child, a mother-child. And there's a certain powerlessness. And how do I make my mom happy and not get her angry at me? And that's how we treat nature. Is like, let's blame it on someone else, right? Blame the sixth extinction on the orbital dynamics. But as we become adults, and I call this phenomenon the bar mitzvah for humanity, and in the Jewish tradition, the coming of age for boys and girls when they're 13, it's just opening the door to being adult. And for the first time in the history of our planet, we have the opportunity and even the need to become adult and actually say where we're going, rather than depending on Mother Nature to take care of us, because we've dominated the planet, and we actually have to be adult and say, okay, we're going to keep a beautiful planet. We're going to continue the decreasing birth rates, which will take our population back to sustainability, and do the things that will have nature restore CO2 rapidly. Again, read my book, Climate Restoration. Let me just show climate restoration, the only future that will sustain the human race. I don't want to go technical here, but all that, you consider that stuff is in the bag. And what we need from the audience here is to say, okay, we're going into that future. Now let's keep it diverse. Because once you say we're going into that future, your actions will naturally be in harmony with that. If you don't have a goal, and the trouble with climate action the last 50 years is the goal was climate action. And so we run around in circles. Once you say, okay, it's restoring the climate and restoring a sustainable population, that actually becomes easy. And now the challenge is, how do you keep this diverse planet in the place where we want to make love to people? And it's like, and we want to absorb their culture. God, I don't know how they're going to do it, but it's going to be great when they do. Figuring out how to keep it beautiful and diverse, and while we're all exploring it.
Well, yeah, and I think it's interesting that nature's conspiring to help us. There's. I take people to the Amazon every year, and to the indigenous people there, and I take people to the Mayan people in Guatemala and to the sacred sites there, which I just came back from last month from taking a group. And one of the things that you find that people are very interested in sacred plants that like ayahuasca, that's become a big thing. And I have some misgivings about how big a thing it's become, but that's another topic. But the fact of the matter is, the plants are speaking to us. Those plants are speaking to us, but so are all the plants. Vegetarianism is becoming huge. I just became, conscious not too long ago of that, and became a vegetarian, and I feel better for it. Herbal medicines, herbal plants, people growing plants, planting trees. I think the plant world is speaking to us. The animal world is speaking to us. The micro world is speaking to us. The pandemic was a call to action, and one of the things it taught us was that we can change. People fear change. We must change now. And the pandemic taught us not only that we can change, but we can enjoy it. We can learn to play the flute, or write a book, or whatever, read a book, you go to a movie. People did all kinds of things because of the pandemic that they'd wanted to do for years, but hadn't done. And, it's talking about the sixth extinction. The Mayan people they do these fire ceremonies, beautiful sacred fire ceremonies. And when we're there with them, our groups, I don't take more than 15 people. Every fire ceremony starts by the shaman, a woman that they call a nana, or a man they call a tata, or both, drawing a circle in the ground with using sugar to make a white circle, and then a cross that goes east and west, north and south, and within the 4 quadrants a little dot, and each of those dots represents one of, they believe, 4 previous times when people practically went extinct. And once was the flood, and the shaman shifted us into fish, and we survived the flood and then came back as people. Another one was the great fires from the volcanoes. We shapeshifted into birds, flew above the fires. Another one was the winds, the hurricanes. We shapeshifted into monkeys and clung to supple trees and survived. And the last one was the earthquakes. And we shapeshifted into bats and flew into the caves that were created and enjoyed ourselves and came back. So human beings survive these 4 periods in their mythology by shapeshifting. In the center of that cross, it's in the middle of that circle. So there's these 4 quadrants with these dots that represent those 4 times. In the center, there's a little circle, and that represents now, the 5th time that we're on the verge of extinction. And there, it's not 6 for them, it's 5, but it doesn't matter. There's a little circle. What do we do now? What do we shapeshift into? And the answer is, well, this is the only time that we humans have caused the threat of extinction. And so the only thing we can do is shapeshift our consciousness. And so that's what the shamans are now teaching. How do we shapeshift our consciousness? And that's why they're inviting us to come down. And incidentally, if any of the listeners would like to join me, just go to my website and sign up for the newsletter. We'll be announcing dates soon next year, johnperkins.org. But the fact of the matter is, the indigenous people are speaking to us. The plants are speaking to us. The animals are speaking to us. The bees are speaking to us. All the insects are speaking to us. The microorganisms are speaking to us. The viruses. The universe, the planet and the universe, I think, are conspiring to help us realize that we must change. And I believe consciousness is changing rapidly. As I travel around the world or talk to people on Zoom during the pandemic and since, all over the world, you hear people everybody's talking about this. It doesn't matter what country you're in. People are becoming increasingly conscious. The question is, what actions do we take to transform this consciousness into a new reality? Again, perception molds reality. How do we use our consciousness to arrive at a new perception of what it means to be successful humans on this planet that'll mold a new reality?
Well, John, one thing I've discovered over the decades is the question, like, what action do we take? What consciousness do we take? And of course, the two are very closely related. When I first got involved in hunger and poverty was with a hunger project, and I wasn't too sure about it. But I said, yeah, it's a good idea to end hunger, and I'll give $25 a month. But I noticed that after a year of writing a check for $25 a month, which was not particularly painful, the way I say it now is my brain realized that I'm committed to it, and that I didn't know I was committed, but then I had brain patterns for being committed to it. So it goes both ways, that things like recycling technically don't make very much difference, but in brain patterns, it makes a huge difference, because when we take that second to sort out where we're going to throw things, that reminds our brain that we're committed to the community and to nature. Right. And so it's beautiful that it goes both ways. And when it comes to restoring the climate, there's only a few companies that are needed to do it. Just like it didn't take that many companies to put CO2 into the air. It's not going to take very many companies to use nature to accentuate the natural processes that'll get it out very rapidly. But we all need to be involved and find those ways to participate, and enjoy participating, which then shifts our consciousness. Because how do you shift consciousness? It's through action. And how do you shift actions? Through consciousness.
I'm going to invite Jim back into the conversation, but somebody in the chat added to your list, John, was our hearts are speaking to us as well.
True. Excellent addition.
Well, thank you both, John and Peter and Tom, for convening this session. Where I'd like to enter the conversation is along the following way. When you were speaking, Peter, about understanding Putin's worldview and the fact that he comes from a KGB background and so forth, and that's his playbook. Rob Wheeler put in the chat, maybe the issue is less Putin and a KGB perspective than understanding that the reason why the Russians took their action is because of the United States and its relentless expansion of NATO to the east, and in the face of which the Russians finally said, "You're crossing a red line." And I want to bring this in, starting with you, John, because I think since we're all Americans on this program, it's really important for not only for us to talk in terms of universals, what all of us need to do to ameliorate climate, to deal with climate restoration, to bring peace on earth. But I think there's a particular awareness that citizens of the United States need to come to grips with about the responsibility of the United States for much of the carnage that's happening around the world. And I want to push that in the following way. I read your book, your first edition, John, when it came out, and one of the illuminations for me about your original Confessions of an Economic Hitman is that this was being driven by the United States through the international institutions. And I was astonished. I had fought against the Vietnam War, and I thought that what the United States was doing in Vietnam was absolutely egregious, but I had no idea till I really read your book about how the United States in the aftermath of the Second World War, using the great power that it had gained, was choreographing and pushing out there into the global political economy an economic hitman scenario that was victimizing the rest of the world. And one of the reasons why that session about Ukraine went viral is what Vladimir Putin was saying, is that yes, Vladimir Posner was saying is that yes, Putin invaded Ukraine, but if you really understand that invasion within the larger context of the agreement 30 years ago between Gorbachev and the United States and NATO, whereby the Soviets withdrew and the United States agreed, as Secretary of State James Baker put it, that the United States would not move NATO 1 inch to the east. Well, it did that. So part of the issue, it seems to me, that we all need to grapple with is the role and responsibility of the United States in the problems that the world is being forced to deal with. And because it's not sort of a universal culpability here. And when you think of, for example, how China is maneuvering in the face of the kind of the economic hitman, using some of the techniques that they learned from you and others, but just observing where the world is. And now China allying itself with Russia, but also providing some peace proposals for Ukraine, even as it brings Saudi Arabia and Iran together. I think one of the issues in the world right now is that the world is moving away from US primacy, and struggling to articulate another way of being in the world. And if when you think of what China has done, and I want to just make this one point, and then starting with you, John, have you respond. One of the reasons why China has the longest history of any nation in the world, over 5,000 years, it's lasted 20 times longer than the United States. We're now coming into close to our 250th year. So we haven't even gotten to our bar mitzvah yet, Peter. You're absolutely right. China passed the bar mitzvah thousands of years ago. And one of the reasons why they have endured for so long is because they recognize that war and imperialism ultimately is self-destructive. And that's one reason why China never sent imperialist forces over the Pacific to take North America, or around Africa to take Europe. They conquered adjacent territories for sure, but they have largely, for most of their history, been a trading nation. And that's the Greater Silk Road, as they're calling it now. So I think in terms of this issue of both culpability, but also in terms of an emerging consciousness, it feels to me as an observer, it's happening outside the United States and almost against the United States, which doesn't seem to be able to get beyond an economic hitman strategy and a perpetual war machine. So I just would love to, since we're all Americans here on this call, I just wanted to identify what I believe is the elephant in the room, and that is the aggressiveness of the United States that is causing so much damage around the world and is pushing the outer limits of the capacity of the planet and the capacity of the world order to handle this much rapaciousness.
Yeah. Thanks, Jim. My family goes back over 300 years in the United States. I grew up with both a mother and father who came out of the, we fought in the Revolutionary War, our families. And one of the reasons I'm angry is because I've always felt that America had an incredible potential to do good in the world. Mm. And when I was an economic hitman, chief economist, whatever, back beginning in the 70s, we believed that it was a struggle against the Soviet Union. That the Soviet Union truly was a threat. Kennedy believed that the whole space program you mentioned was about that, and so that was a motivating force. And at the same time, the Soviet Union tempered us so that if we get a little bit too heavy-handed through the World Bank, one of our organizations in Latin America or Africa or someplace, the country would invite the Soviet Union to come in, and then we would have to fall back a bit, change our policy. So there was a mitigating force there. And then in 1991, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, suddenly the United States emerges as the sole superpower. And we had a great opportunity to do great things, to spread a good form of democracy and a good form of capitalism, a form of capitalism that would not be predatory, that would not be based on big corporations, what we have today. But we didn't do that. Right. Instead, we moved forward exploiting so much of the world. And then along comes China. And China has this very successful model it can show of incredible economic growth, pulling people out of poverty, and so on and so forth. And by 2012, when Xi Jinping became leader, he decided to go out into the world, not just make China better, but to go out into the world to kind of use our model. And we had been shooting ourselves in the foot in the United States because we had been exploiting countries, this tremendous resentment, not of Americans. And people want to come to the United States, no question about it. They love the idea of the United States. They love the idea of the opportunities for people. And generally speaking, all over the world, if you go as an American, you're going to be well received. But what they don't like is what the government and our corporations have done to exploit them. And then, we were fighting these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And after 9/11, the United States devoted almost all of its resources to those two countries, to the Middle East. We forgot about Latin America and Africa pretty much. And China moved in big time and began investing in infrastructure projects, exactly the things that we had done. And I think China's motivation is to take resources like us, like I said before, the economic hitman strategy. But the fact of the matter is they walked into a void that we'd left these parts of the world. We were focused on Iraq and Afghanistan. We were focused on killing people. We were focused on war, not on peace, not on helping people, regardless of what you think of foreign aid. And I have a lot of doubts about it, as you know, the way it's usually practiced. But the fact of the matter is that we were focused on killing, on wars. And then as those two wars wind down, suddenly Russia invades Ukraine, and we basically get deeply, deeply involved. And now all of our resources are going to Ukraine. And China was smart enough to stay out of Iraq and Afghanistan and a lot of the Middle East and focus on developing its relationships with Africa and Latin America. And now they're doing it again. And they're taking advantage. It's almost as though Ukraine has laid a trap for us. And, yes, that the aggression, the brutality that Russia is inflicting on Ukraine is outrageous. But as you said at the beginning of the program, Jim, the answer's got to be through negotiations and peace. And as I just came back from Latin America, and people there, and I know it's also true in Africa because of Zoom calls I've had, they're concerned about climate change and starvation and malnutrition. and disease, more pandemics. They see more pandemics coming their way, and all the reasons why their people are desperately trying to get out of those countries because they can't survive there anymore. They're like, wait, this war is just causing many, many more problems, supply problems. We're not getting fertilizers, we're not getting food. Come on, cut it out. This is a white man's war, a European war. And so the world is looking very askance, much of the world, especially the global, what we call the global South, is looking, like, what are you doing? Why are we going to war again? Why is the United States pumping up more fossil fuel production when you were committed to stopping it? And at the same time, China comes along and presents a different view to the world, and does seem to be brokering peace. And as a friend of mine, a Latin American friend, just recently said to me, he said, your country doesn't even talk to Russia. Your presidents aren't talking together. China's president, or China's leader, chairman is talking to Russia's president. We like that. You got to talk. So yeah, there's this perspective. And the United States, in a way, also, we're very, very spoiled. As people around the world often point out to me, you've got no enemies on your borders. You got Mexico and Canada and the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and your country's full of resources. You live in a I don't know what, a fishbowl. Almost everybody else in the world is surrounded by enemies. I mean, it's, Russia certainly is, China is, Ukraine is, Latin American countries have fought with each other. So it's really interesting so Americans have a very, very different perspective in general. There's certainly a lot of exceptions. And I hope we can move beyond that, because in order to understand the world and to change our own view of it, we need to be able to empathize with what other countries are going through.
Thank you.
I think that Mary Thorpe at the very, very beginning quoted Bucky Fuller talking about going from a you or me world to a you and me world. And when someone is blaming us for the Ukraine war, or blaming Russia for the Ukraine war, it's like, we're all in it together. It's you and me. We're doing that. And the bar mitzvah for humanity is all of us. It's humanity's bar mitzvah. It's not America's or Russians or China's. We're all playing on the same game board, and we have to mutually agree to change the rules, right? Because generally in a game, the lower it devolves to the lowest common denominator, and so it really requires leadership to bring everyone up to the new level. And infighting is not the way to do it. Love, it seems to be. It sounds trite, but I can't.
Yeah, that doesn't mean it's wrong. Let me ask you all one last question. I know we're pushing the time, but this is such a rich dialogue. And given the fact, I mean, you've been chronicling the economic hitman, John, and Peter, you're a very successful entrepreneur and corporate executive. I would love to have your comments on the collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank in Silicon Valley and Signature Bank in New York. And I just ask it, remembering 2008 and the collapse of the market back then. I mean, in the opinion of you two very insightful and learned gentlemen, how are you viewing what's happening? And are you seeing this in a larger context, or is this just two banks that happen to fail, but everything else is moving merrily along? What's your view on the current state of the economic situation from that vantage point?
Well, as a physicist, what I've seen and what I've read, it makes sense, is we had the interest rates increased very rapidly. And whenever there's in any system, when there's a rapid change, you get disruption. And I interpret the bank collapses as the Fed saying, oh, maybe we increased rates too fast. In any case, we can correct for that disruption because of the rapid interest rate increase. John, what do you think?
Well, it's too soon, I think, to draw a bigger conclusion. Let's see what happens. So, I believe it was smart of the administration to step in and say we're gonna pay back everybody, not just the not just the 10% who legally are insured under the insurance policies that go up to 250,000. That's only like 10%, I think it is, of the investor of the people who have their money in the bank. We're not gonna help the investors in the bank, but we are going to make sure that all the people who lost money by having money in the bank are going to be made whole. I think that was smart and on one level, because it stops a rush. On the other hand, it doesn't. You don't want to send a message that you're going to bail out anybody that goes through that, because it just isn't enough money to do that. But I also think that it's showing us a basic flaw in the Federal Reserve system. This whole system that's based on interest rates, and the fact that these banks did so well, and Silicon Valley did so well when interest rates were really low, and they could borrow a lot of money to put into these things. And now interest rates have gone up, and everybody's suffering. And this really is pointed out that a system that's based on debt and interest rates is not probably the best system to have in the world. And here again, we're looking at China is in the process of trying to replace the dollar with the yuan, because they realize that any nation that has the major currency of international trade can impose sanctions. It's really tough to impose sanctions if you don't have the major world currency, and can control commerce on so many levels. But China has to be careful because they're owed a lot of money in dollars, particularly by the United States. So they're trying to move in, and they're negotiating a deal now with Saudi Arabia where they will buy Saudi oil for their currency, for the yuan. And also Russia's buying a lot of things, and not with dollars. So there's a movement in this direction. I think in the long run, somebody is going to come up with a currency that isn't dependent on the Federal Reserve System approach, which is based on debt, which is, as we're seeing in this most recent bank fiasco, this interest rate system is extremely vulnerable. It's extremely sensitive to change. The whole economy is very sensitive to changes in interest rates, and only because we have a monetary system that's based on interest, that's based on debt.
Yeah, well put. Well put. The economic hitmen are still alive and well in the USA.
Unfortunately.
Well, but it's so much the game that I gave a talk a couple of years ago at University of Glasgow where Adam Smith taught. And it opened my eyes to how that really framed our whole world outlook. Now, not Adam Smith. He was a brilliant representer. He didn't invent this thing, but it's got his name. That it's all about growth and avoiding domination of other empires, right? Essentially, he was defending the British Empire from the Dutch Empire or something like that. And it made perfect sense back then. And we need a new, and it's time for the new episteme, the new epic, where instead of growth and our domination of our thoughts, Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," and so much of our identity is to do with our thoughts now. Again, that wasn't Descartes' fault; he just got the name. The name fell on him, and we're developing this new epic of humanity flourishing, about I am humanity, that if who I am isn't just this identity and this thought, but actually I belong literally to future generations, that's a different outlook. And it's very joyful because I don't worry about dying, because the future generations will continue. And now my job is to make sure that they have a planet and a narrative that makes life flourish. So but my point is that I really urge us to focus on where we're taking humanity, and then that will pull the structures, that will pull the Fed and the interest rate structures to produce that result. What we have is a structure that pulls for economic growth. And we might as well say it was good because it's what we did. And who wants to blame God or the spirit for doing something wrong in the past? So we'll say that was good at the time, but now it's time to do something that has humanity in the nature of which we're part flourish. And I think we all want to do that. And then it'll be fun to see what economic systems evolve from that. But it's not likely to, I assert, is a bit argumentative, John, that I don't think changing the economy is going to change the outcome. It's the changing the outcome is going to change the economy.
Good point. Back to what you were saying originally, John, that the indigenous people say that perception is everything.
Yes.
Perception creates our world. And well, thank you both for such an illuminating and deep dialogue today. Tom, you're a master at convening the right people at the right time around the right issues. So I want to really thank Tom Eddington, everyone, for everything that he's done to help grow Humanity Rising, and just the scope, Tom, of your intelligence and your capacity to convene. I just want to acknowledge that today. And why don't you give us a final word?
Yeah, thank you, Jim. I think, for me, when I look at where is humanity, back to your question to John and Peter, we're behaving like adolescents. And one of the roles that Humanity Rising is playing is to helping to grow up humanity. The guest and the work that John's been doing for decades and Peter's been doing for decades, and so many of the other thousands of guests who've shown up on Humanity Rising, it's helping to grow up our species from adolescents to adults. And certainly the US is one of the youngest nations on the planet, and we're acting like irresponsible children. And so growing up humanity is a critical role that has to happen. I think specifically to your question about Silicon Valley Bank, the biggest concern I have is they were one of the largest financial institutions funding climate change initiatives, solar panel companies, wind and alternative renewable companies.
Good point.
And I don't know that there's any organization or facility that's going to step in to fulfill that role. And so it's a huge setback to the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. So I'm very concerned about that. And it doesn't seem to be getting a lot of attention. In terms of the conversation today, John, Peter, thank you for all that you've been doing to help elevate human consciousness and making a difference in the world. And tomorrow is a continuation of this conversation around celebrating the activities of people that are trying to change the narrative to help grow us up and to make it possible for the human species to continue to survive, but ideally thrive on this planet.
Great. So Tom, just as a physicist who's been analyzing and working in the energy transition and climate, the good news on the energy transition is highly unlikely that the Silicon Valley Bank failure will impact it. If you look at the future, when we've replaced fossil fuels, we'll have replaced it with clean energy. And it's going to be mostly solar and wind. There'll be a little bit of nuclear some places. There might be fusion or cold fusion. But we have the technologies already, and newer ones are developing. And it's just a matter of building them out. And so if some of the innovation slows down, it'll slow things down a little bit, but like a year or two, it's not that big a deal. So I wouldn't lose sleep.
You're an optimist, Peter. John, any quick word from you as we close?
I think we pretty much covered it. Thanks, Jim. Just again, repeat that I think every listener should feel blessed to be alive at this time and to get out there and ask yourself these essential questions that I mentioned earlier, and start with, what do I most want to do for the rest of my life, and how can I do that in a way that will make the world a place future generations will want to inherit, will thank me for.
Yes.
Whether it's a small thing or a huge thing, it's important. So I think we should feel very, very blessed. This is a time of incredible challenges, crises, and amazing opportunities to make humanity rise, to keep humanity rising.
Yeah. Thank you, John. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Tom. That will bring our session to a close, everyone. You're all welcome to the after session chat. You'll see the link in the chat box, and we'll reconvene tomorrow, same time, same station, for session 2 of Tom's program on endangered species, and how individuals like John and Peter are making a real difference simply by following the pathway of their heart. That's the bottom line for humanity to rise, is a loving heart that knows that every choice, every word, every thought matters at this very precarious moment in our history. And we need to take that in, and all of us make our lives count for something that our children under the 7th generation will be proud of and point back to us to say, at that moment, our ancestors did what needed to be done to preserve life for us. That's what it's about. So thank you, gentlemen. Beautiful session today. And thank you, Tom. See you all again tomorrow. Bye for now.
Thanks, everyone.